Yeah, thanks for everyone to be here. Thank you very much for the folks joining us online. It's a pleasure. Hopefully everything is going okay in terms of video and audio feeds. If there's any problems during the stream, please just let us know via the chat. That would be great. So without further ado, we have Emre, who's going to be talking about maintaining stereo-like cohesion in an immersive environment. And just by way of quick introduction, Emre started his career as a session drummer and programmer before moving into mixing, production, and is most recently Atmos mixing, being one of the first independent studio owners to commission an Atmos rig for music. He's now well over 1,000 mixes into this format for many major labels like UMG, Sony, and Warner, as well as independent projects. So, Emre, thank you ever so much for being here. It's an absolute pleasure. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, so I've spent a lot of my time in the last 2 years or so mixing music for Atmos. I'm going to look at my phone a lot because I've got all my notes on there. But yeah, so I started off mixing with quite a sort of a fairly strict brief for maintaining a stereo-like coherence in the mix and to be faithful to the stereo mix. Initially, there's obviously a massive amount of creative stuff we can do with Atmos, but this was the sort of task that was set, and this is mixing from stems, very occasionally multi-track, but really mainly stems, and creating a immersive version of the stereo file. So that's one part of what I do. The other part is either from multi-track or stems, creating a new imagining of the track, and that's a brief usually dictated by the artist, and I've not really had that particularly from the label, very occasionally from the label. And so I wanted to chat a bit just about my experience of this as an audio engineer, working in this immersive format, which has, I mean, so many nuances and so many pitfalls, frankly, as well, for everyone involved, and to try and, I don't know, make some kind of sense of the comments I get on a daily basis about the format and a lot of the rage and anger directed towards it, which is, I mean, I think anyone who's involved in Atmos will experience. It's a very controversial area, as for, well, I'll go into all the reasons potentially that I've found, which will relate to audio workflow eventually, but initially are more background, I think, for the format. So I think the first thing I've found or really worked out is it's all quite potentially controversial to talk about and potentially aggravating. So I'm trying to negotiate my way through that in a kind of useful way. So I'll talk a little bit about the economics of Atmos, because that really is what has defined a lot of the current workflow, the current state of Atmos mix deliveries and how it's worked out. So it's, compared to a stereo mix, it is effectively a much lower fee with a much higher time pressure usually. I mean, the delivery times on Atmos are often at the very end of the entire ingestion process. We will probably get asked to do an Atmos mix. And this really came about in an unusual way for mixing, in that it wasn't really driven by the labels. It was more driven by, I guess, really Apple wanting this immersive format to come out and insisting on an Atmos companion. Now, this is murky whether this actually happened, but there was pressure from Apple, definitely, and for Atmos companions to the stereo mix to come out for playlisting on a huge DSP. So this was a request. Suddenly, my manager had been in 2 weeks before, I remember this, saying Atmos is going to be a thing, do you want to chat about it? To absolutely zero response. And then after 2 weeks, they were like, oh my God, you were the guy telling us to do the thing that we needed to do this mix. So this was whenever it was, May or June, two years ago. So it was definitely a big panicky rush to get all the Atmos done. And there wasn't really particularly a benchmark, apart from Universal, where they'd had a sort of working practice before this dropped, which is actually, if you read through the entire deliverable working practice sheet, was actually really a good map for doing a immersive version of the stereo mix, and gave you loads of information about it. It was quite involved, but you know, you could work out what you're meant to do. So this is is the thing I'm sort of skirting round. You have this kind of perfect storm of very low fees, quite high time pressure, and then the fundamental issue with making this whole thing work with Atmos and engineering is the quality of archiving and stems in the music industry generally, which is just, I mean, is there a diplomatic way of saying it? Atrocious? Yeah, no, it's really massively variable. I mean, I remember about the third or fourth Atmos mix I ever did, I cut in the stereo mix because there was just the middle eight was not there in multi-track or stems. It had been edited in the mix. Definitely, someone had done something or flown something in, or and that was early on. I didn't really know exactly how to deal with that, but so there's this kind of thing. It's still going on now, and we're still finding out more and more what exists and what doesn't in stem form. And I think those kind of three things are maybe the bedrock of the main complaints I get about Atmos, which is uncohesive, muddy, unsatisfying, doesn't really relate to the stereo mix, not as good as the stereo, and other things like this, which I would sort of often it becomes kind of subjective. So whether I agree or not, it doesn't really matter. That's the comments I get from large amounts of engineers, A&Rs, artists, consumers even are giving this kind of feedback. So that's obviously what people are kind of hearing on the streaming services, and if they get to preview stuff out of the room generally. And this folds down to a problem really with delivering on a wide scale in the binaural world, really where most of these complaints come to. If you sit in the room with a good Atmos mix, almost everyone's going, this is great, and but that's not the experience most people have. So we're coming to what really attracted me to getting involved in Atmos as well, which is honestly, and I'm probably shooting myself in the foot saying it, I wasn't that interested in the immersive side at all. That's really not what interested me at all. I never was into 5.1, and I mean, I love the immersive side. It's fantastic. But what really attracted me to it at the very beginning was a purely technical concept of a portable file that I could have a perfect stereo fold down, which then I could upscale to theatrical. This was like, oh my God, is this possible? And working with it certainly up to the larger HE formats, yes, very easily. Up to theatrical is a completely different conversation. Having this portable format was really appealing, and I loved the way in stereo we could match a fully limited -5 LUFS file and bring it down to -18 LUFS with -1 true peak, have all the dynamic range, and it still intentionally be identical, really, really the same. And when I start, it's a very complicated swirl of workflow to preamble basically everything I'm saying. But when I'm doing one of these stereo mixes and converting it to an immersive version, I will first take the stems, I will run off a premix of the stems, closely aligned to the quietest part of the master. So I have a kind of baseline of where this mix should be. I will have that fold down, which is just a stereo mix effectively, which I'll make mono for the sidechain being mono in Pro Tools, compensate for the level, and feed it to a mix bus, which is all ganged across the objects. And however many stems there are, say there's 35, 40 stems in stereo, that will be 80 channels of mix bus now, effectively. So it doesn't matter where the objects are going, and I don't tend to work on the masters, so it will be a discrete 80 channel mix bus, and then match the mastering from there so it cancels. My aim is to completely cancel when the master's polarity inverted. It should disappear. And what you do when that's really successful is you just hear the crunching of the limiting and distortion. But if you take that off and A/B the mixes, they will feel surprisingly identical, and that is really interesting. I didn't expect that, and I think I talked to actually Ian about this very early on, going, I'm getting what I didn't think was possible, which is a way of undoing some of the loudness, which isn't necessarily always necessary, and having the same experience with the mix. So this was what really excited me about Atmos. And this, I suddenly thought, wow, so if I can manage the binaural world, let's not worry about Apple Spatial now, but in the Dolby binaural world, I can have a portable format. I can make something that could technically replace stereo, which is something that Dolby have mentioned a few times, but we're coming from potentially, I'd say, slightly different angles on that. I'm not trying to get rid of stereo. I love stereo very, very much indeed. But I'm saying this could be faithful to the stereo and be immersive and be satisfying immersively and in stereo. And that's my perspective from the very beginning, which I think I'm now 1,600 mixes in or something, and going, so that seems to be translating in some way to what other people are after as well. That again is more blanket the statement than it seems, because a lot of people really just don't care at all about the Atmos counterpart at all. It's a box ticking exercise to be dealt with. And that's often at the label level. It's an admin chore. And Atmos is, I mean, so much more than that. It's an unbelievable technology, I think. And I really think it's incredible and improving all the time. And certainly since 3.7.2 in the renderer, the binaural has been significantly better. Having your own custom head reflection transfer function is fantastic. There's loads of improvements making the tools becoming better. But we are still at this strange, I think we're at a dip now, really, in the whole Atmos creation world. And this is what this talk is sort of meant to be about, even though I'm stumbling around, because it's sort of in some way so daunting to talk about the problems versus the pros of this format without appearing like an absolute idiot, because it's still subjective whether something's good or not. And that's, you can probably technically say how closely it will correlate to the stereo mix, but that's not necessarily relevant in some ways. It depends on the user experience, and that is always going to be subjective. So this is a pointless talk, but no, but that can probably lead me on to some actual useful stuff about workflow and about what we deal with on a daily basis with Atmos mixes, and how we could possibly talk about the usefulness of thinking about cohesion in Atmos as a sort of something to, I don't know, maybe to look for in mixes, and can understand or sympathize with people who are giving negative reactions to them when that element is lacking. It's quite hard to quantify, but it's something that I have found in my experience, that if the Atmos, the stems that have come in the pre-master stems are matched absolutely exactly to the mastered mix, the mix generally, if mixed so the binaural isn't out of balance with the stereo, the room mix will generally be really cohesive. You'll generally get a very immersive experience. It won't just be a stereo plus mix. And I'll get onto that in 1 second about the various fake MOS, which is a huge problem at the moment with Atmos as well. There's fake MOS, flat MOS, which is basically a 5.1 with defined sides and really nothing in the tops, or a harmonizer and some reverb or something thrown up there. There's not actual discrete use of heights. Fake MOS, which is stereo with a bit of reverb at the back, and that happens quite often. Or upmixing, which is now illegal. Technically, you'll get your mixes pulled down, and there are automatic detections, and people are QCing for upmixing. And but upmixing, I'm going to fly off on these tangents all the time. Upmixing is a huge part of my mixing process, but it's not. The mix is not mixed. I use upmixing a vast amount, because often if I'm doing a modern liquid drum and bass pop track, I'll have drums, respace, a sample, and vocals, and that's not a vast amount to spatialize. But I want to get a fully spatial experience that feels satisfying in an Atmos room, translates well to Apple Spatial, and works well binaurally. So some upmixing is going to be used within the context of my mix, and that's a huge part of making things spatial and making it work really well on headphones, is managing how everything goes everywhere in a intentional way. Because one thing about Atmos, which is possibly a negative, is when you're sitting in a nicely tuned Atmos studio and you're putting stuff everywhere, it sounds great. It really is just a great experience, and people have gone, this is amazing. And then you've got an automated panel which you can sequence and move things around. You go, okay, well, this is crazy. And then you've got a mix that sounds like it's a theatrical trailer. Yeah.
Somebody's asked if you can define what upmixing is.
Oh yeah, sure. It's taking a stereo source or actually, let's keep it simple, taking a stereo source and expanding that stereo source to fill, 5.1, 6.0, 6.1, 7.1, 7.1.4, 9.1.6, and it will generate content based on that source that will fill that area. You get two kinds of Atmos upmixing that generally the plugins do, and there's two main plugins. One is really dynamic and one is more static, and that's a very powerful tool for a mixer to use. So you can, like Halo is extremely dynamic and will react to the source, and Pentio will generally be more static. And the Pentio downmix is 100% perfect. When you're flicking between the two, it's literally the same, and that's very powerful. But also you need to listen to the speaker mix versus the binaural mix. And this is feeding into actually what I'm talking about. Just the issue of, when I'm trying to explain it to people, I'm doing a master speaker mix on my true speaker system that's been calibrated and I trust. That's fab. I have that as my master. That's my true master that will have some longevity and that won't change. That's my master. Then I have a binaural mix I can't mix, but I can affect how that sounds with how far each object is into the room. And that will have a vast impact on balance and perceived balance, even though it's not necessarily allowed. So you have to experience this to really understand it. And it's very hard to explain how the binaural room sounds. And even when you're sitting there working it out, it's quite tricky to work out what impact everything has, whether it's mono in phantom stereo, how that works, whether it's high, low, everything has a huge impact on tone within this is the Dolby binaural room. So you're effectively constantly, if you're trying to match the stereo mix, you're constantly having a balance of the satisfying intentional placement in the room versus the problems that can give you on your own personal experience of a binaural mix, which is, again, deeply personal. I get no spatialization from binaural at all. My friend feels like it's the best spherical thing. That just depends on your head and your ears and your training to some degree as well, and what you've learned. I think I've talked to Mike before about binaural, and you can work out what it's meant to be even if you can't hear it, and you get used to it. So there's this whole balance, but that in itself, that's quite tricky, and that takes a lot of experience. And if you've just dumped a bunch of stems and say do an Atmos mix, which happens all the time. Someone who is not even really a stereo mix engineer gets an Atmos mix dumped on them because of the economics of Atmos. And so this is a massive problem for the audio industry. I think if they're trying to launch a new format, it's very tricky because you can't not release content as a label. So you can't pay for the content with maybe who you choose to mix it, or they're not interested, because if you get XXX for one mix versus XXX for another mix, it's like, what are you going to choose to do? It's not really that much difficult. And also there's so much negative energy around Atmos, and certainly from more established engineers as well, it's very hard to show because it's hard to necessarily demonstrate consistently satisfying Atmos mixes. It's a difficult balance to really push this forward in a really useful way. So I think how difficult it is to deal with what we're given is a part of the problem here. And I think it's takes a lot of work to prep the Atmos. And I'm going to shoot myself in the foot and say that might be the majority of my work, is prepping it to be mixed, to when I move it around into the room, it still feels glued and coherent, which is my very unscientific really way of talking about stereo mixing. It sounds like a record, and that is a term that comes on and followed me through my career, and that's where you get hired, to make it sound like a record. It should still sound like a record in Atmos, not an event, not a theatrical experience, which is quite easy to achieve in Atmos because it's a great technology for cinema and for excitement and for gimmicks and for incredible experiences in audio. That's awesome, but that doesn't necessarily translate to headphones, which is how many people get it, or even necessarily to small arrays like soundbars, or even really incredible things like the Sonos Era 300, which is a really amazing box for demonstrating. I mean, astonishing. It won't necessarily be the same as sitting in front of your incredibly powerful rig. hitting at, you know, Dolby calibrated levels, which are quite loud at -18. That's pretty damn loud. It's impressive, but that's, you know, like blasting a mix loud on huge Genelecs. It's exciting, but I'm not sure that's going to necessarily translate in the end of the day. It's a similar world we're in here, but there's all kinds of other factors that as an Atmos engineer you sort of need to be aware of, and a lot of it is room setup and calibration, which obviously there's help with, but there's also fundamental issues with, unfortunately, economics. Again, it's like Atmos rigs are expensive to install. It's people want to incorporate their stereo rigs, so you get something that I personally, well, people can disagree as much as they like, it's just my experience, I've never really got on with front-loaded Atmos rigs that are, I see, like equipotential rigs that are basically the same speakers all around and maybe smaller on the tops. It's because when I move a source around, I want it to remain the same everywhere, absolutely. And we get a lot of things I've seen is mixing three-way speakers at the front in the left, right, and sometimes the LCR, and then two-way all around. And now I'm not an expert on the physics of acoustics, but this can definitely cause incurable phase problems, and people suffer with this in their rooms because they have to be able to have a stereo rig that works and an Atmos rig, so it's sort of compromises there. And you also get other problems with speaker cabinets that are less known, and I've only found about by looking into this more, like speaker manufacturers will flip the polarity on the tweeters on some boxes and not others, just to take crossover problems to out of audible spectrum. And so you might get 9 boxes, and if 3 have a flip tweeter, and then you're in your room trying to correct it. This is like a problem in music. It's and a lot of the problem is the vast amount of stuff to deal with. It's like it's a really quite a big thing, because this becomes very precise when you're really trying to match stuff. It's almost post mastering the process. Sometimes it's like, well, we've had it mastered, now we need to recreate that mastering, but dynamically across a live mix across many objects. And people who are more familiar with Atmos might know that there's the option of using a bed, which is a 7.1.2 block of channels, so 10 channels, which you can pan things within freely, and basically will give you a 10 channel mix bus. The trouble with this is, binaurally, I've never really found this to translate very well. So certainly with movement, and often just with static placements, it's an issue. It does give you a tiny channel count and much easier to match things, but I've never really found that personally to work. So I would use an object bed or multiple object beds, where I assign objects with specific binaural metadata, and I can use those to really control headphone translation. But again, so we're into something that's reasonably complicated. If I have 3 different object beds, I'm needing to really understand routing within my DAW on quite a decent level, and to control the multitude of returns, and which, I mean, Pro Tools has made it easier now with object group folders and stuff, but nonetheless, it's like, it's not a stereo mix. It's quite complicated, potentially, if you get into this. And this is, again, a slight impediment to getting a really nice workflow. You have to be quite dedicated to getting your Atmos game together, and that is not an opportunity for that many people, I would say. So it becomes potentially a headphone solution to get it out the door and go. And this is something I get asked a lot as well, which I was going to touch on, is, can I mix it on headphones in my room? Really, is that all right? And yeah, I guess you can, with a lot of experience, I can get pretty close, and I would then go in my room and finish it. So I've never delivered any mix ever just on headphones, because no matter how well you know your rig and your headphones, you go in your room and go, what have I done? There's something somewhere that will be surprising often, because it's so, you can't just rely, your true master is your speaker mixer. And I think that is just really, I can't get away from that myself. I'm sure some people have had more success than me, but I can't better my speaker mix ever on headphones remotely. What I can do is tailor my speaker mix to make the headphones as translatable as possible. But even that way of thinking is like not really stereo mindset, really. This is something different, and it's quite a jump. So yeah, the other thing which is really, this all rests on, which I think is the fundamental thing we are missing in this process is artist approval, because artist approval now is generally an MP4 because they've got AirPod Pros, and so that slides slightly neatly onto Apple Spatial, which is Apple do it differently, which I don't really want to massively get into. It is important to know that Dolby, if you use AC4 format when it's delivered, you'll get the binaural metadata that I've printed into my mix will be read. With DD and JOC, which is the Apple Spatial, it doesn't read my metadata. It's a 7.1 fold down, which is then 7.1.4 fold down, which is then spatialized in the hardware, in the AirPods or the AirPod Max. I don't know what the other ones are, sorry. But so you're getting Apple's version of my mix, which isn't what I did. This isn't not what I did. The balance of this 7.1.4 fold down before it was spatialized is my fold down with post-is clustering, which is something else that is actually worth knowing about when you're mixing Atmos. But that's something, this is more feeding into my, oh my God, how much is this guy talking about? What, this is just putting, this is 5.1 plus, isn't it? No, it's not. It's much deeper in order to understand what you're doing and how it translates. And translation is everything in, I guess, everything in mixing commercially is translation. You want your mix to be that mix. And it's the same with this, but it's way more complicated. So when you're doing your Apple Spatial mix, until recently, you can't hear it really. You had to print an MP4, get it on your phone, put it into the files folder, and then press play. And for me, A being, I'm not that good. I can't do that. This is not how I A/B things. I like to flick and know what's going on. So then I can stream it into Logic now and do a live. So coming out of my Atmos renderer, for example, in my simple setup, is my speaker mix, a binaural fold down for headphones, a 7.1.4 re-render to Logic, a binaural re-render to Logic, so I can flick in Logic easily, and then a 5.1 render to another unit I've got, which does things. So that's all coming out live, which is in fact incredible from the renderer. It's amazing it can handle this, and this is all running on one machine with my massive. I mean, it's amazing tech, but that's quite a lot to manage, and that's just for me checking translation. You know, which is on in my stereo rig, which I have separate. I have 3 sets of speakers, and I flip between. That's much simpler. So this is just, and I will very, very thoroughly check everything constantly, and I will check Apple Spatial constantly and see what it does. I mean, previously it's better now, but if I had any percussion elevated above a certain height, it would do a huge boost, maybe 3 dB or something more of anything sort of vaguely transient and upper midlight would have a huge boost. So I can't put percussion on any mix up there because my balance is completely gone. And now that's different, and you can move things around and things change, and it's just a very evolving form at the moment. And this is, I think, another part of the complexities of trying to deliver coherent Atmos mixes. It's evolving. We're early. What, 2 years in? I've actually lost track. I'm so tired. I don't know. It's two and a half years or something in, and it's early still. You know, I don't quite know the history of stereo as well as I should, but you know, it's not dissimilar to some of how this started. But you know, it is evolving, and the tools are becoming better. But I would postulate that it's still too hard to really consistently deliver this over and over again with all the factors I've mentioned before. So I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with any of the tech. I think it's just a perfect storm of factors that make this very difficult to what people are complaining about to argue against it. Really, I think that probably a lot of these complaints are very valid because of these factors. But there's a whole load of other things which we don't really deal with that much or aren't talked about a lot, and I see a lot in other mixes, which are use of size and LFE. And size is just, you can't really use it in music because it doesn't work as size in headphones, it works as volume. So if you can make it spread around, size is when you make an object spread around more speakers, which is great. Apart from binaural, it just makes it louder. So that makes it, I mean, unusable for me. I mean, very occasionally I will find some position which maybe I can use size to bulk up the volume of the thing without impairing the speaker mix. But this is the kind of juggling I'm making. That's not thinking about music. That's kind of technically thinking, what volume differences am I making here versus spatial difference? That's not a musical decision, really. It's a technical decision of coherence, and that's I don't know if I really want to be thinking about that massively. I'd rather be mixing and making things feel good. But and the other thing is LFE, which is a big problem I see a lot. And hopefully Mike will talk about LFE because it's a really interesting one. Loads of domestic and other consumer Atmos gear has no LFE. So if you rely on all the bottom end from your mix coming from LFE, which is great because it's not counted on the loudness calculation, so you can make your mix louder, you could have no bass whatsoever. And if it plays in several situations, there'll be no LFE. So it's really something I use as a slight enhancement if it's in a big room, when at a certain level, a little bit more low end might work really well. But it's just another thing to think about. There's loads of cinema technology in here, which is not really, I'll happily say to anyone, I don't think it's that relevant for music, the LFE, particularly low frequency effects. If I have a low frequency effect, I might use it, but it's not for my low end at all. My low end is from my full range system, which means bass management is an issue on your rig, which is another thing to think about. The other thing, which is a cinema hangover, which impacts everything we're talking about, is center speaker usage, which I'm pretty on a recreation, an immersive recreation of stereo mix. I'm pretty fixed on how I do that most of the time, and I'm very much not a fixed kind of producer or engineer mixer. I do all kinds of experiments. I've done some really wild Atmos mixes with some very creative people, and with no relation to the mix at all, absolutely none. A completely new version. Some of the most fun mixes I've ever done, with some of the really lucky to work with incredible artists, and that's great. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about when the artist isn't involved, the producer's not involved, and the mixer's not involved, and it's a commission from the A&R, and they want an immersive version of the mix to be as good as possible. And they do listen, and I get a lot of mixes approved because it ticks the box of it being, this is the mix we have already approved, thank you. It's an immersive version, but it's the same mix. And that's, a valuable thing to do. So center speaker, there's a lot of people, because it is quite appealing in the room sometimes to put the vocal bang in the center, but you get massive problems with headphone translation with this, like every single time. It's often an enhancement of what's already in the mix, but I've found a little drift into the center is very useful, especially when it goes into Apple Spatial. If the head tracking is on, it will make it slightly more coherent for me. And in the binaural, it certainly feels slightly more solid. Other than that, I think it's a cinema hangover. I'm not really sure that it's great when we used to phantom center vocals so much anyway. And actually, weirdly, wideness in binaural you would expect to be intuitively, well, it's going to be much wider. It's not, it's narrower. You're getting a narrower field generally. And if you have a lot of widening on the mastering, that's a really interesting thing to deal with in Atmos. And that's another thing to, if someone's really gone heavy on the wideness, that becomes an interesting thing to recreate, and how that translates in headphones and binaural. And then in spatial, you have to be really careful and really check what you're doing. And you might find if you're upmixing things, for example, you won't use the front of the upmixer because that's almost always a narrower field than the stereo field you're originally hearing. And also the tonal differences you get in working with expanding stereo field in Atmos is really profound, especially depending how your room set up as well. So these things can spiral you into a world of pain very quickly. And I guess it's just a sort of experience and awareness of how you want your mix to come out the speakers at the end. Is similar to stereo, but that approach is not used as much as I think it maybe should be generally. There's a lot more creative mixes going on and that stuff, but if the artist isn't involved, I have a slight struggle with this often. I think as artists more and more come on board, we're going to see a shift in how Atmos mixing is done. And as Atmos production becomes more possible with integrated renderers and or people just working in 714 and then going into Atmos after their production is done, that will be quite interesting because the fold downs in Atmos are astonishingly good. The stereo fold down of a well executed Atmos mix is amazing. Like, I can't believe it. If I flick my physical output to 2.0, it's like, oh my God, it like sounds like the stereo mix. But then you can just with one click, it's 916 or 714 or 51. And this is the amazing thing about this format, with a certain amount of compromise on how you do stuff. and how translatable you make it. So I'm almost finished ranting. So yeah, I mean, a tiny talk about being aware of clustering. This is like it's slightly complicated, but I guess it boils down to there's spatial emulation encoding in the renderer, which will give you an idea when everything is playing at once, what your mix will sound like when on DSPs, close and near objects are clustered together as a single point. So to save bandwidth, basically. I don't know if this is changing or if codecs are changing particularly, but it's worth being kind of aware as if you mix without that, you won't really know what's going to happen to your mix at the end. It's not printed through, it's just a monitoring function on the renderer, but it's really worth listening to. Apart from if you didn't really forgot you turned it on and start soloing things, it's bizarre as bits of bass drum will creep into the vocal channel and things will slide around it and you won't know what's going on. It only works when everything's playing at once, but it's a really good indication of what's happening on, I mean, if you said it's a 16, that's the usual playback, I believe, but it will give you a really good indication of how your mix is going to translate on DSPs. Yet again, another thing to be aware of that maybe, would be very different than a stereo kind of concept. So, yeah, I guess any questions would be great if anyone's got any at this point.
You were talking about the problem of putting a vocal in the center channel.
Yeah.
Does that apply if you put it as an object in the middle of the image as well?
Yeah, I find the headphone translation interesting.
Okay.
And not consistent and tonally dependent as well. Yeah.
You might have to repeat the questions for the benefit of the people online.
I was going to say, yeah, there's one coming, I think. 2 seconds. There we go.
Ah,
All
yeah.
right.
Okay, yeah.
Shall we? I'll tell you what, if I copy it out to the chat, everyone can see it.
Oh, they heard the question. You speak loud.
Big mouth.
I think we just got
Obviously, I need to.
Oh, direct message, my bad. Everyone.
Yeah.
Steve, is it worth reading it? For
There we go.
replay?
It's gone out to the chat, but yes, I will reread it for the replay. Sorry, getting in your space here.
No,
to
it's all
apologize.
good.
All right. So a question from M Chuck. Hello. You mentioned not having a good experience with binaural sound in general, but also the Dolby's renderer has improved and spatially custom HRTF. Could you perhaps expand on this, especially around your experience with custom HRTFs, how you derived it, etc.?
Yeah, there's an app on the phone, face recognition enabled phone, and you rotate around and it naps your head and your pinner to some degree, but it then you put it in the config folder in the renderer and you can flip between the standard renderer and your personal HRTF. And I noticed a dramatic improvement in tone mainly. And that balance seems to translate to other people's experience if they're using a custom HRTF too. So it seems to be right. That seems to be more like what I'm actually hearing. I mean, this is all very personal, so it's a little bit tricky. And I'm absolutely no expert in this area at all. But I definitely get an easier binaural experience and find it seems to be translate better when I use that custom HRTF. But that's from an app, which I think is available to everyone now. Is
that the Dolby one?
Yeah, the Dolby one, yeah.
Right, because I tried the Apple one, I didn't like it.
Yeah, I haven't tried that yet, but this is actually baked into the renderer. It's in Emre's HRTF. So I think anyone who's using the renderer can use that now. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Cool. Seems to be more coming in, so I'm just going to switch sides with you. Is that okay? Thank you very much.
Yeah, but it won't. Sorry, center channel will give measurably better speech intelligibility compared with a phantom center. No, not this especially. No, it's especially matters to hearing impaired listeners. Yeah, it unfortunately will change the balance of the mix and possibly the intention of the mix, which is a problem if you're trying to deliver it back in the same way you've given it. It's not like a no. It's just something I've found. Oh yeah, that one, right. It's an issue with recreating the stereo mix. But yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't know enough about how that intelligibility is affected. I know that if you have a dense mix and you put something in the center, you're going to hear it better, but it also then you're going to have issues of how did the effects work and how did the original intention of the mix work, and that can be an issue. But I've used it loads in more creative mixes, but not in these kind of converting stereo to immersive mixes without making a fake Atmos mix, you know. Sorry.
Okay.
How do I deal with pre-mixed lead vocal stems? Right, sorry, should I?
I'll shout it out. So from Pat online, thank you. How do you deal with pre-mixed lead vocal stems sometimes sounding hollow and lower in volume, both in speakers and in binaural? Do you compress, audio mangle some more on the pre-mix stem?
As I sort of mentioned at the beginning, I'll make the stems exactly match the master. So it will be the same, all the levels. And sometimes that's really intensive, like, you know, going through and recreating automation, depends what I'm given. But it will be the same. So it will translate across the same. The only reason it wouldn't is if I'm changing it, really. So it will be the same. If I spatialize that stem, then yes, it will have a small room reverb on it and feel difference. But my vocals are often off, but I have very little off in terms of like near, far, mid, and off. Often lead vocal and drums will be off in the binaural world, but the rest is spatialized around it. So that's not a mad secret. It's really pretty common, and often like a common, you know, a common bed setting. If someone's doing a bed mix, will be off LCR and then maybe middle round, or maybe near sides and far rears and far tops or something. You know, it's a combination people use, but it's derivations of that. But the front wall is often off for me. It's always off, pretty much.
Okay, I think we have time for one more, and it comes from online.
It sounds quite interesting.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So for a stereo track that is being spatialized, what does the workflow of going from stereo to full Atmos, not algorithmically upmixed, look like? I'm particularly interested in the sonic reference / starting point. Where do you start, and what are you listening for when you're surveying, oh my goodness, the original stereo master?
Right. I mean, that is the crux of everything. That's if I'm understanding it correctly, you're not talking about doing an AI stem separation. You're talking about having stereo track, getting the stems, and then making a spatial mix. So matching the mastering, what you're listening for. This is basically forensic listening. You're listening to what did the mastering engineer do, and you'll be able to see in the premix. I mean, you could just visually see most of the time with a lot of modern music, you'll see that you'll have wildly dynamic sections that are no longer dynamic. So you go, right, well, there's probably some limiting or clipping going on here, or both. And you have your tools to do this. And there's a fairly standard bunch of these that people often use. So I will key these from a premix and match the mastering by ear. It's all by ear. And luckily with Atmos, which is nice, you have a fixed level meter. So you can tell your level. You have if you're just doing a single, that'll almost always be a -18. If you're doing a mastered album, I always find the loudest track, make that -18, and then take everything else down by the same offset. So you follow the original intention of the mastering. That's useful. So you'll find your level and you match your stereo mix to that. So this involves, yes, playing the entire stereo mix down, the entire Atmos mix down each time when you're checking your level. So you get it absolutely as close as you can by ear, and then give yourself a little reality check with the level and see where you're at, and check tonally it's the same. And sometimes I'm going through 4 bar section, matching each integrated level on each section when it's a really tough one. And I'm every single 4 bars will be the same integrated level as the stereo master, and the tone and everything will be the same, and I will be polarity inverting the master and trying to make it cancel. Now with modulating program material, it's never going to cancel, but you know, you'll get the drums and the bass will completely disappear often, and you'll get vocals and some synth stuff and some reverbs, but you know, you can tell when you're getting the same world. And that's most important, is the blind test flicking, and before I start I'm going, right, it's the same mix now, and I won't even think about spatializing until it is. But you know, that's this world. It's a completely other, it's not binary, but you know, it's a different thing. I did a lot of work with Brian Eno's work at the beginning of this year, and none of that is like that. It is all completely new imaginings of the track, absolutely, from multi-track to a new version. I mean, we match a stereo mix in that actually. Even though I said that, I literally recreate the stereo mix, the mastering, but the spatialization, the headphone is all really different. And we did the new album, and he changed loads, took loads of stuff out, just deleted tracks, added new, he made a new track, and it was amazing. But that's, you know, all the bass was made mono and put in one corner on one of the tracks, and that was the main bass of the room. But it worked. He understands very well. So you know that the artist was there. Do it. Anything you feel amazing. Let me try and make that work so it still, you know, works as a mix. But it's.
How does it feel in binaural? Does it work in binaural as well?
Yeah, it just doesn't sound the same as the stereo. That was the job. You know, get the spatial positions and then make it make sense in binaural and in spatial. So that's a fine balance. I didn't want to change anything he'd done, obviously, because that's definitely not the gig. So you have to change the positions and work out not the spatial positions, but the space into the room and where things are going to be and what objects are going to go on. And, you know, that's the juggle, but that's really creative. That's not what I get to do very often at all, but it's a lot of things that people do when the artist isn't involved, and it's a massive change to the mix. It's like massive change, and you go, oh, it makes me uncomfortable. So, yeah. Is that okay?
Absolutely ideal. Thank you ever so much,
Nice.
Emre. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Our next presenter is Mike Hillier. Again, brief introduction. Mike is a world-class mastering engineer based at Metropolis Studios in London. Since 2020, he has been working in immersive audio, leading the development of the studio's immersive audio techniques and workflows, both in Dolby Atmos and Sony 360. Today, the talk is going to be on redefining Atmos workflow, mastering for Atmos. So again, without further ado, and far too much from me, over to Mike.
Perfect. That's what I was going to ask. Firstly, I'd like to start by thanking Emre. I think that's the third time I've seen you give a presentation, and it's wonderful because my favorite bit is that I sit there going, yep, I've had that exact problem, and that is how I solved it too. So good, I'm not mad. So thank you very much. I don't do presentations. This isn't me. I'm going to try my best. I'm really tired. I got into Atmos about two and a half years ago, somewhat by accident. We built a room at Metropolis, not for Atmos reasons, for completely different reasons. Then Apple launched Atmos, and we were like, we've got a room that'll do that. Do we have anyone who knows how to do it? Nope. Okay. Dolby came in, they gave some demos, and I sat there going, this is dreadful. The tech's cool, but where's the music? I think I can do better than this, and that is why I got into it. And I'm a mastering engineer, and I'm hearing talk from Dolby and from other engineers that there is no mastering in Dolby Atmos. I'm thinking, bet there is. Bet I can work it out. So that's why I got into it. I wanted to work out how to do mastering, and I wanted to make the music the focus of the work that I was doing rather than the technology the focus of what I was doing, which is what I felt a lot of the demos lacked. And I get it from Dolby's perspective. I'm not hitting on them too hard. They had to display to everyone that they were showing what it can do. And the best way of doing that is by displaying the tech, not the music. It's just the music should always come first. So that is, so I got into it, and I'm still doing it now. So it's obviously not the worst thing in the world. Do I have a mouse somewhere? There it is one. There we go. That's all right. So 90%, 95% probably of my work is kind of the same as what Emre was describing, of multi-tracks or stems most of the time, hopefully, occasionally not, and you've got to recreate the stems first. Making those into an Atmos thing with pretty much no involvement from the person who did the actual mix in the first place, other than providing the stems. And often no involvement from the mastering engineer, other than providing me with some masters to reference against. That is how everything is pretty much done. What I am suggesting is that, hopefully you'll agree with me by the end, there's a better way of doing this, which is to use the same person for your Atmos master as you use for your stereo master. Hopefully they will have both availability for both rooms, or a room that's capable of both, but ideally 2 rooms, which allows then the mix engineer to be the same person who does the stereo mix as who does the Atmos mix, at which point then I've included kind of 2 ways of doing it. You can have the stereo mix and then make your Atmos mix, or you can make your Atmos mix and then make your stereo mix from that. Have at it, that's your decision, but then send it to someone like myself who's a stereo mastering engineer who masters it and then applies the same processing, hopefully because it's come from the same mix engineer, the Atmos mix and the stereo mix will sound alike. So with the same processing, the Atmos master and the stereo master will sound alike. That's what I kind of want to get to as a process. I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about the techniques and things that I use to accomplish mastering. So yeah, a few things. First, we kind of covered it already. ADM, if I use that phrase, it doesn't actually mean what I often use it to mean. General ADM is kind of a format and Dolby is a subset of it. Whenever I say ADM, I tend to mean the ADM file, which is the deliverable that you will present your Dolby mix in. So it's a multi-channel broadcast WAV with metadata on each file on each object giving the location over time. So yeah, so when I say that, I mean the file format, not the technical audio definition rules. I'm going to use object-based and immersive audio interchangeably, and I'm going to use channel-based and surround sound interchangeably. That's how I work. Deal with it. And yeah, when I talk about mastering, I don't just mean bus processing. I mean the entire process of mastering. Mastering is making the music fit the format however it needs to be done. Part of my job is just getting the fades right. Part of my job is crossfades is a nightmare in Dolby. So that becomes a huge part of my job. And it is a really useful place if you have a mastering engineer on your Dolby mix for the Atmos mastering engineer to do your crossfades. You can't do it. Well, I'll get onto this. So this document, which Emre referred to, the universal Dolby Atmos spec sheet, which I've included the link down there. I strongly recommend if you ever do any Dolby work that you get this, you read it. It's full of really, really useful information. It does contain rules that you just can't break, but it also includes a lot of advice. It's brilliantly written. I have it printed out and sat on my desk. I gave a podcast with Caroline, who wrote it, and it was the only time it wasn't on my desk, and that was really upsetting. Someone had moved it just in advance of the podcast because I went to refer to it and it wasn't there. So yeah, in that, amongst the things are the following kind of delivery spec rules. Your ADM file must be 24-bit and 48K. Now there is technically you can deliver at 96, but it will then be sample rate converted at the Apple or Amazon or wherever, because they will only stream in 48. So I only deliver in 48. I'll keep it at 96 for myself, but I will always deliver a 48 as well as the 96 if I've got 96K audio to work with, which I don't usually. It has to be 24 frames per second. These are just rules. The loudest track, which Emre went into again, must be no more than -18 LUFS. I do exactly the same system as he does of going through the stereo audio, finding the loudest file on the stereo audio, turning that one down until it's -18, turning every other file down by exactly the same amount. And that gives me a kind of macro dynamic pattern across the album that I can work to. You don't have to exactly match it. It doesn't sometimes correlate one-to-one, but it's a really good kind of roadmap. Yeah, there are other things on there. True peak must be no higher than -1. This is mastering, by the way. Following rules is mastering, not bus processing. The timing. This Atmos file must match the stereo master to within 50 milliseconds. I find it really odd that they've defined it as 50 milliseconds because you don't have sample accuracy. You only have frame accuracy when working with Dolby. 50 milliseconds is essentially a frame. So you've got a frame to work with. Obviously, right, if you're the mix engineer and you've done your stereo mix and then you do your Atmos mix, you can't finish your Atmos until after you've had the stereo master back from the mastering facility. This is another reason why I think it should all be done in a different way. Because if I've done the stereo mix and then I do your Atmos mix, well, I can line them up and that's really easy for me. But if you're having to go wait for me to then finish your own job, that seems back to front. Yeah, and there's an expectation that the sonics will match, which is basically all that Emre covered it massively. So I will rush past that bit. Oh, what have I pressed? Apologies if I'm talking really quickly. I'm nervous. Right. So how do we achieve what tools were we given by Dolby? Well, they made the Dolby Atmos album assembler. The album assembler, which you can see here, it was a nice touch. I don't use it at all. I've used it literally twice. The first time was for a playback session that we were hosting at Metropolis, where we had like 15 fans come in, and it's a really good way of just lining up the whole album in one hitting space. You can show them exactly what button to press to switch to the stereo, and you can then leave the room. And the second time was I just finished an album and I wanted to go through and I'd done all my printing offline. Now I don't do that normally, but for this album, because there were so many crossfades, it was the only way it made sense. And I wanted to measure my loudness of each track to make sure it mapped what I expected. And there is a offline loudness analyzer in this. So that's the only 2 times I've ever used it. The reasons I don't use it, so what does it have? It has gain, it has EQ, it has a limiter. You can't use your own plugins. So you're kind of fixed onto that EQ and that limiter, which is a thing. I mentioned it has the stereo reference, which is probably its best feature. It's got trim and fade tools, but no crossfade editor. So you cannot crossfade in it, which is problematic. There's no option to process individual stems. So yes, most of the time as a mastering engineer, I want to apply the same EQ across everything. But there are times when I'm mastering where I might, for instance, do some mid-side processing to try and bring out a vocal. Now, when I've got all of the stems, I can just put that on the vocal. I don't need to put it in some mid-side complicated weird thing to get that effect. I can just go straight to it. I may as well just do that. So occasionally it is nice to be able to process individual stems. There is no option to edit the panning or the bonus. So you're fixed. That could be seen as a bonus in that you can't mess up the mix. It's there and it's done. But if it's wrong and you want to change it, tough. And there's no ability to add ISRC codes, which is also annoying. So instead, I do it in Pro Tools. Here is an example of a master that I did last week. And what I think is going to be interesting about this, and we can go into it a little bit, is it has all the stuff Emre was talking about again. So you can see I've got all the way across the top is the top 2 channel inserts are EQs, Pro Q3 and the Sontec. The third insert is a compressor and the 5th insert is a limiter. You'll see I've got a send set up going to mix bounce. That is rendered offline to the, there's a channel there called mix, and there's a duplicate of that called mix.comp. They go to sidechains. So just like Emre was describing, I use sidechains to feed my compressor and my limiter. Importantly, I use 2. Well, I use as many as I need, but on this particular one, I've got a compressor and a limiter, and I feed them from different sidechains. The limiter is being fed by a compressed signal, right? Otherwise, your limiter responds to the uncompressed dynamics, and it becomes a weird thing of trying to readjust your attack and releases to match how they should be responding. And yeah, just just compress it first, it's easier. If you're going to put any other dynamics processing in, you're going to need an additional sidechain for every bit of dynamics processing. So yeah, that's how you do it in Pro Tools. Now Pro Tools, yep, that's the album. So you can see there's even a little bit of automation going on to match. This was a live album, so basically the EQ was the same across most of the record. There's a couple of tracks where I've done a little bit, hence why it's quite basic automation on the Sontec mostly, I think. And then you can see on one of the channels, the lead vocal, I think I've got a little bit of lift as well, which is separate from everything else. So in Pro Tools, you have the benefit, you can use whatever plugins you like. There are caveats on that. They need to have a sidechain input on them. If you're using a compressor and it doesn't have a sidechain input, you're stuffed. Not many limiters do. That's pretty much why you'll find almost everyone in the Dolby Atmos mastering world uses Fab Pro L2 because it has a sidechain input. Ozone does not yet, but I've moaned at them, so hopefully they'll add it. You can still do a stereo reference. It's a bit more difficult. It's not one button press now. It's Shift SM, so solo the stereo and unmute it, and then same again and listen to everything else. You have trim, you have fade, and you can importantly crossfade because you're in a proper DAW. You can process individual stems because you're working in a DAW. You can, and this is possibly a negative now, you can go in and mess up the mix engineer's panning and binaural metadata, and you can really mess up the binaural metadata because Pro Tools doesn't read it at all until you print, when it's hidden in a tiny little box somewhere. Do you want to follow the metadata from the track that you imported? And you're like, well, I've just imported 15 tracks, actually. Oh. Let me go back and work out which one I want to follow. So that is something you really have to pay close attention to. And the way you can work around it is you can import the original ADM that was sent to you to be mastered into the Dolby renderer, and then you can read it backwards. So Pro Tools can then copy its settings from the renderer, and you can learn what each one needs to be, near mid far, all that kind of stuff. Obviously, if you're using the album assembler, you don't have that as a problem. Pro Tools still doesn't do ISRC. I've moaned at them as well. Nuendo does. It's the only one that I know of at this point, but it has loads of other problems when working in Dolby Atmos. It's very clever, and if you're using your 7.1.2 bed, but you're only using 5.1 channels of it, rather than just sending the unused channels muted, it deletes them. That's a problem for Apple and Amazon and other distributors who don't know then what to do with that. So yeah, it's efficient. I wanted to talk about crossfading a little bit because honestly, it is the most difficult part of working in Dolby Atmos. You cannot, there is no method really for crossfading properly. The only way to do it is if you've got two files, is to import both sessions into one session, crossfade them, print them as a single ADM, and then use a tool called the Dolby Atmos converter to splice it in half and create two ADMs. And as I was just saying, this was an 18-track album that I was working on. It was live. Every single track needed to be gapless with crossfades and all sorts of things. You cannot do that in any other sensible way. So I had to have every single one of these 18 tracks in a single session. Now, because it was live and the stems were the same across every single track, but if you're doing that on let's say an electronica album that maybe is DJ'd and crossfades, it becomes very complicated because your object numbers need to maintain the binaural metadata setting across the tracks that they're getting. You can't have it being near up until the crossfade and then suddenly it's mid. So it becomes a massive headache of shuffling. Okay, that bass can crossfade with that vocal because they're in the same space. That drum can be that drum. That's cool. The guitars can go with that guitar, and it's a real shuffling nightmare, especially if you have to do more than one song into another. So almost to the point where, as a mastering engineer, you're like, I hate myself for having done the crossfades in the stereo version. You're like, I wish I hadn't, because now I've got to fix it. But at least there are tools for fixing it, unlike with Sony. This is the Dolby Atmos conversion tool. That's it. It's really basic. It's literally it. That is the album that I've just printed. It's an hour and a bit long. And you can trim it and type in to the frame where you want your start and your end. It'll only do one at a time. So when you finish, you put your start and your end in for track 1, you have to put it back in and do your start and your end for track 2, and then print that, and then put track 3 and then print that until you got to track 18. Yeah, be nice if there's a better way of doing that. Yeah, I've spoken really fast, haven't I?
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think
Perfect. As before, we're open to the floor for questions, and we'll see if any come up online. I'm sorry.
that's all right.
Get right in front of you.
There seem to be some up there.
Yeah, I think they were from previous, so I'll just double check. Yeah, they are. I can't go done. That's live, done. Excellent. Chat. We had something appear in the chat very early on. Thanks, Emery. Very good. Okay. So screen sharing stop. We're back in the room.
I've got a question.
Yeah,
Perfect.
First question.
I don't remember.
Yeah.
Well, okay, what do you say? Obviously, you're a mastering engineer, so
Yes.
you're biased. Do you think there should be
Maybe.
mastering for Dolby Atmos? And say somebody has done a mix or a master on headphones, has never had
Yes.
a speaker setup.
Yeah.
The mastering stage is basically essential
Mhm.
in that case. But if somebody has a decent setup that has been checked at least by Dolby, in your experience, is mastering still needed?
Yes. Is it in the simple answer to that is all the best mix engineers working in stereo still send their work to a mastering engineer. And it's not just because the mastering engineer is better at using a limiter. Like any idiot can use a limiter and turn it up till it's hitting -4. It's because the mastering engineer listens, and it's like an extra. They're going to do the extra layer of QC. They're going to do. They're going to give you a surety, so you know it's being treated right. They are going to do all of the other tasks that I've gone through, all the crossfades, all the guaranteeing that it is to the sample accurate, or to the frame accurate, sorry, lengthwise. They're going to make sure that the overall loudness kind of property from start to the end of the album works. Like the acoustic ballad in the middle isn't really loud right after the rock tune. It's quiet comparatively. All of this kind of mastering, right? They listen on a kind of, we listen on an album-wide bent as opposed to like a song thing. So yeah, it's just a different process. And I think if you agree that you should have your stereo mix mastered, then it's not a huge ask that you should have your Atmos mix mastered. And then throw in the fact that, yeah, as you said, very few people actually do have really, really well treated high spec rooms. You know, I'm blessed. I have a 11.1.8 room Metropolis. It's mad, but it's too many speakers. You know, each one of those speakers is quite expensive. If you're a mix engineer and you're not Spike or someone making, you know, a lot of money on an individual mix, can you really afford, let's say, 10 of those? What the minimum spec speaker you're willing to work on? You need 10 of them and a sub. It becomes very expensive to kit out a room, plus then the acoustics. Yeah, you want to get someone else involved.
So have you done projects where people are mixing on headphones and you've got kind of the final say on the speakers, and does that work? Or is that kind of a problem?
I've done a few. I don't know that anyone's been working on headphones on anything I've done. But I have got final say. So this album, I had final say on positioning anything. If I wanted to move it, I could have done. But really, the point was I'd done the stereo mastering for this one, and it was easy to be like, right, well, you liked what I did. I'm going to do the same to your Atmos, and then you'll like that too. It made it better, didn't it? Yeah, good.
Does that mean the stereo was moving that dynamic?
Well, on this particular album, it was. Yeah, it's a live album. It didn't need to. It's a really nice. Live at the Albert Hall, Ray. It was lovely. It's not a squashed record. And yeah, the Atmos is probably the same level of that. It's probably just as squashed in that neither of them are that squashed. Yeah.
Well, in comment to Ian's question is that, you know, the mastering engineer was kind of the stage where you could take a mix from any studio and make it transferable onto any system. And it seems now much more important because now you got so many different types of mixes to go on so many different
exactly. And there's
systems.
And that's it. There's like, so Emre was saying how he has like, you know, his lovely 916 room, and then he's got a button that you can press and it goes into 5.1 mode, and a button that goes into stereo mode, and another button presumably will do his Sonos Era 300. I know this because I have exactly the same setup. I push a button and it goes 5.1. I push a button, it goes stereo. I push a button, it goes to the Era 300. Push another button and I go from discrete monitoring with the LFE to bass managed. So I can quickly compare all of the different listening environments. I've got Audeze headphones, Apple AirPod, the tiny ones, Apple AirPod Max over-ear ones, Sennheisers. I've got like 6 sets of headphones all ready to go because there's so many different interpretations of that one ADM file that, yeah, it just makes sense to be able to, you can't do it if you can't listen to every single thing and know that it's going to translate across all of them. You need to know it's going to translate from the room to binaural to Apple spatial and to kind of those, like the Era 300 and similar boxes. The point of them is they've got like these side firing speakers, up firing speakers. They bounce off walls. They don't sound great in studios, funnily enough, because they can't bounce off walls. I have one in like the room just to the side. But they sound completely different. Like they sound really, for like 400 quid or whatever it is for one of those, it's a surprisingly good Atmos box, but it doesn't sound like 9 or 11 or 24 speakers. It just doesn't. It never will, but they're cool.
Both you and said they've kind of mentioned about kind of fitting the sound into a channel that you've got in playback, but then you also said said about the renderers changing and evolving over time.
Yes.
How do you deal with that? The fact that
So
you're mixing now, but then in 5 to 10 years' time.
So Emre did actually make this quite clear. The speaker mix is the master. So while the renderer changes, the way the renderer works with the speaker mix doesn't change. The way it works with binaural does. So that can just be thrown out the window almost. Like, and it has changed already, at least once, possibly twice. So 3.7.2, which was the previous big change is the current kind of model, massively changed what near sounded like. Near went from a very weird kind of shelving EQ thing to it's still a shelving EQ thing, but it's flatter. And yeah, they will. I no doubt that will change again in future. The clustering thing, again, you can turn it off with and get your proper speaker mix, or you can turn it on and see what that sounds like. So it's one of those things of like, yeah, if it works in the room and it translates to all of the current ways of the end user listening to it, then it's probably going to be fine going forwards. But the ideal is that your speaker master is the single file that's going to stay constant and not have to change.
All right, we actually have a couple of questions from
Okay.
online, so if I may. Question comes from James. Many thanks. Are you linking the compressors / limiters to the stems, or are they set individually?
So yeah, they're all working off a sidechain. So my EQs are all linked. So I group all my channels in Pro Tools, and then in the group settings under attributes, you can tell it to link inserts. So any change you make on one EQ applies to every single EQ. Similarly on the compressors and limiters, but you can then, if your compressors all keyed off the mix channel, then every compressor is going to respond in the same way because they're all being triggered every time the mix gets loud. This is really important, right? So this is what gives you bus processing. If you're triggered off a sidechain, a muted channel will still be reduced in volume because it doesn't matter. It's not listening to that channel. And this is really important. The thing about bus compression is that it will respond differently if the kick hits to if the kick hits at the same time as the bass. Because if the kick hits the same time as the bass, there's extra level. If the kick hits on its own and the bass hits slightly later, they respond differently. That is bus compression. That is the glue. That's the thing we like. And the way to get the kick and all of your things to respond like that is to have them listening to the compressors, listening to that summed mix stem. That summed mix stem only goes to the sidechain. It doesn't go anywhere audible. It just goes to a sidechain, and it gives you bus style compression. It gives you the sonics of that. It gives you the glue factor that we all like. Similarly with the limiter, like I'm hitting it a lot less than I would on a stereo mix, because if you're quite experienced with limiters, there's kind of like a curve. And at first, when you start using it, things start sounding a bit nicer and you get a bit density sometimes. And then after a while, you get distortion and things start falling apart and things start not sounding good. But yeah, you get louder. Well, I don't need that bit at the end where you get distortion and louder, because I've got this -18 max integrated loudness. But I can use that little bit at the beginning where things are starting to sound a bit denser if I want to. I don't have to. And there are mixes where I haven't used a limiter, and there are mixes where I've used it literally just to make sure nothing ever goes over. But at -18 LUFS with -1 dB of true peak, not usually going anywhere near over. I'm usually getting, like, I've usually got 3 or 4 dB of headroom, and that's fine. So yeah, but yeah, it's really useful. It's a really powerful technique. It gets you the sounds, that thing that you like about limiters you can do without doing that thing about, which is just there for loudness.
That's really interesting, because I've done lots of studying about, summing in master bus, and the intermodulation of the signals interacting together is what causes the terrible distortion that we hear. So what you're doing is basically doing it by channel, still, but using the master bus to control it. You're not getting the intermodulation distortion, which is pretty awesome.
Yeah, I'll take your word for it on that.
Perfect. Okay, one more from online. Comes from Pat. Thanks, Pat. Wondering how you get Sonos ERA 300 to work. Supposedly only Atmos's streaming services. All right, cool.
Yeah, Pat, I'm really sorry. The answer to that is Sonos gave me a special beta version which has a Dante input. It doesn't have any of the Sonos software on it. There are only 50 of those that they made. Yeah.
Commented out on that. Very good. All right, any more from the floor?
I have one that came up when Emre was talking, but you can
Yeah.
as well. But I've noticed it. He was talking about the fact that often the binaural actually sounds narrower
Yes.
than stereo. And I was just curious, what if you've got a solution? Is that a per song fix, or is it a case of turning off the binaural metadata for the front wall, as he said, or because there are lots of mixes out there that don't have that problem, and there are lots of mixes that do.
Yeah, so this is what I was saying at the beginning, where I've encompassed all the same problems and I use kind of the same fixes. So yeah, my vocal is often set to off. My drums, which are on the front wall, are often set to off, and my bass, which is always on the front wall, is often set to off. So yeah, that helps because that just makes it stereo, right? If it's off, it is just stereo, standard how you're used to listening in phantom mono in your ears. The other thing that I really like about that is if something is off, I feel like it exists inside your head, whereas something that's set to near is in front of you. If it's front wall and near, it's kind of here, but if it's off, it's there, it's inside. And the first, or like maybe the second mix I ever did, that was the complaint, was, oh, I like it in the room, but when I put the headphones on, the voice isn't inside my head like I'm used to. And I you know, it was the first one I'd ever did. I didn't really know that you could turn it off and that would fix that problem. So we foolishly put it round to the side and moved it closer, and that didn't fix the problem at all. It just made the room sound worse.
Okay. What's in the Q&A chat? I do apologize. I seem to have missed a couple of things from the Q&A. Sorry about this. So thanks for bringing that to my attention. Do appreciate it. So from Stefano, can you repeat the sidechain processing, please?
Okay, so I'll go through it. Can we bring the slides back up?
For sure.
And
I say that.
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Let's give it a bash. Cool.
Yeah, that's the one.
Slideshow. Get rid of that for you.
So if we go to
Please.
this one, right? So you're there. Right. If I go through the channels one at a time, the first one's binaural. That doesn't do anything. You can see it's not even got an output. That's just a place to put the binaurals plugin. You can actually put it anywhere, but I like to put it on its own channel because then I can hide it. The second one is my LFE with a filter on it. So if anything I feed to that as a bus goes to my LFE. On this particular mix, I'm not sending anything to it at all. The next channel is my masters. So that's my stereo masters turned down on the clip to make the loudest track -18. And next one is where the sidechain starts. It's labeled mix. That is a print. So of every single channel, every single stem to a stereo mix. So some people print to mono because sidechains in Pro Tools are mono. I print to stereo because I also use that print to allow me to align the audio to the stereo master. And so if my mix and my master are both stereo and they both are at the same loudness, they should look pretty close, and I can find a peak on one of them and line it up to exactly sample accuracy. And then that goes out to Mix SC, which is a mono sidechain. That mono sidechain feeds the input of every single one of those Pro C2s. The threshold of that Pro C2 then is usually somewhere between 0 and -3. I found this really nice, completely by accident thing where if you turn the mixes down the clip with clip gain so that they are also -18, that just is the right level to go into the compressor at 0 threshold, or near 0 threshold. It almost always works. Almost always. I can't tell you why. It just does. I then duplicate that bounce, which is the mix.comp. It's the same audio. It's just the channel duplicated with the compressor then added. So you'll see on the mix, you've got the EQs already in there. That's so that the compressor is responding to the EQ'd audio. And then the limiter, which is fed from mix.comp, which goes to the output is mix SC2. That feeds the sidechain input of Pro L2 on every single channel. And that's compressed, so the limiter is listening to a compressed version of the mix. And if what you're asking was that's how I do it. And if you're asking, why does that work? then it works because that's the whole mix. That's everything. So your kick, your bass, your vocal, all your instrumentation are on that. And when everything gets loud, every single one of my stems is turned down by exactly the same amount. So let's say, it's the big crescendo-y bit and everything, the drummer hits everything at the same time and the guitars do their big clangy bit. It gets really loud. We turn it down by 4 dB. Cool. Every single stem will then go down 4 dB. And that has the same sum result as mix bus compression. It just sounds the same. It gives you that glue, that niceness that we like, that thing that we like about mix bus compression. Now, this is a really simple example because I'm only using 2 EQs, a compressor and a limiter, and I know that compressor is doing next to nothing on this particular mix. But yeah, you can experiment with all sorts of different models of compressor. The only limitation is that your compressor has to have a sidechain input.
Okay. Okay, there we go.
And then the one I think was just
Repost.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so another one from online. From all the Atmos facilities that you have visited and listened to, are there any that stand out? Either in terms of the speaker specs or the room acoustics, or indeed both?
I've been to a few. I've not been to that many. I'm yet to go to the PMC room. So if anyone from PMC is listening, can I get an invite, please? So the best sounding rooms are rooms that have the same speaker in every single position. My room doesn't have that, but we're getting that. Basically, we've got 3 ways in the LCR position and 2 ways everywhere else, and I don't like it. The 3 ways sound great on their own, and the minute you start panning something to and from those to the sides, it's almost like the vowel sound changes. You kind of go from an oo to an r sometimes. It's really quite off-putting. I've fixed that as best I can with the EQ settings built into the DAD. And it is mostly fixed now from where it was when Dolby had tuned the room. But yeah, I think if we had 2 ways in those LCR positions, it'd be even better. And every room that I've been to that's had everything the same has been, I've not heard those same problems. Our room is absurd in that it's an 11.1.8 setup with 2 additional floor speakers for Sony 360 and a center rear for ambisonics, which I've never ever used. Most rooms, I'd say the high spec rooms are 916. Most rooms are probably 714. Anything less than that, I question whether or not really you can do Dolby on them.
Just a very quick point that's popped in there, just to define what DAD is.
DAD is Digital Audio Denmark. They are the manufacturers of my D2A converter.
And one from Jonathan, thank you very much. What tools do Dolby use to tune the room? Who does it?
I wasn't involved at that point, so I don't know who it was. But yeah, Dolby came and tuned the room, and they used like a room EQ, like a professional version of room EQ Wizard, essentially. I want to say it's called like Spark or something. Sounds vaguely like that. And yeah, it does get you closer. Like when you've got 24 speakers all pointed at you, you've got a lot of problems. I don't know, probably like 2 to the power 24 problems. So yeah, it helps a lot. But I kind of sat down with my mastering engineer hat on and just kind of listened and went, I don't like this. It's not right. And they're like, well, the graph says it's perfectly flat. Yeah, but I hear too much 800 hertz in that speaker. So can we turn that down, please? And yeah, myself and some of the other engineers at Metropolis set up just literally a DPA microphone with Ruby Q Wizard, measured it from the listening position, and most of the things I was hearing you could see in Ruby Q Wizard. So you could see like the side speaker was pumping out too much 800 hertz, and you're like, all right,
Just done it yourself.
well, we did. No, that's the point. We did, but you know, we were doing it on top of what had already been done, and I don't know where I would have started if I'd been going from the beginning, right? So I'm doing like, oh, there's a bit too much 800 hertz there. Can we check that I'm not just biased in my left ear is 800 hertz or whatever? And they're like, no, it is. Cool, we'll fix that. But yeah, it was already on a curve that was close.
Any more from the floor? All right. Well, in that case, I mean, we're just over time, so we've done great. So, Mike, thank you once again.
Thank you very much.
Absolute pleasure.
He's mastered a few of my albums. Sorry.
All right, just a couple of things before we all disappear. First off, thank you very much to the good folks joining us online. Really appreciate having you along. You're welcome back anytime. So do keep abreast of what we do with the Cambridge section and the UK section. Thank you very much to Anglia Ruskin University for hosting us tonight. Thank you so much for the technicians for helping us out with the setup. We have Archie on camera. Same decent job as last time, so thank you very much. We only do this, this has been the second time, once a year, so it is always a little bit fraught, so I hope everything's been okay. So thanks for putting up with, well, me for a start, and any sort of technical things that took a little bit of time. So thanks again, and everyone here for being in attendance, and once again to Emre and Mike for the presentations. Thank you so much.